I work in SI&E, Solution Innovation and Enablement, and that essentially means I spend my entire life, my daily life, talking to customers about security and what HP do in security. A lot of it about cloud, sometimes it's not about cloud, sometimes it's about other things, but an awful lot of it these days is about cloud. I'm going to talk a bit about why you're going to be using cloud and why you're actually probably already using cloud. Why mobile computing is inevitable. You're using it now, you're going to be using more of it. A bit of threat mapping, cloud security challenges. A lot of the cloud security challenges have already been covered in depth by some of the other presenters. So I'll just briefly cover those. But what I want to do as well is give you the service provider's view of the world. Many of the discussions we've had are very much from a customer's perspective. I'd like to take it back to a scenario where I sit across the table from you. And I've done this with a couple of hundred customers at this stage. So I'm reasonably secure in how the provider views the world versus how the customer views the world. And you'd be surprised about the big differential sometimes there is between those two. So I've often tried to get through, my latest challenge is to get through an entire customer meeting talking about cloud without mentioning the word cloud once, because I'm actually sick and tired of the word. We were doing cloud computing in Sun 15 years ago. We called it grid computing, but it was essentially cloud computing then. Cloud is just a marketing term, quite frankly. As was stated earlier on, cloud is outsourcing by a different name, okay? In terms of the innovations that cloud bring, though, there are certain things, which I'll list earlier on, which I'll list in a minute or two, that make cloud not a unique proposition, not necessarily a massively innovative one, but probably the biggest thing about cloud that people always bang on about the technology and the whiz bang and it's wonderful and blah, blah, blah. Cloud, honestly, from a customer's perspective, has very little to do with the technology at all. It's all about the price and the virtualization of the price. Scale up, scale down, stretch, compress. That's really the biggest factor from a customer perspective. And, of course, the price. Bring your own device. In terms of the mobility world, bring your own device is a concept that, even though you probably haven't formalized it, is actually going on in your business anyway, right? Because people bring in iPhones, iPads, iPods, multiple other devices, media devices that your company hadn't anticipated, doesn't control, and can't control. So even though you probably don't codify bring your own device as a company policy, it happens anyway, right? If you don't think you're using cloud now, chances are you're probably wrong. If you look at, that's an iPhone screenshot. So Exchange, probably not cloud, depending on whether it's your corporate exchange or not. MobileMe cloud, Gmail cloud, Yahoo Mail cloud, and I'm surprised AOL are still in business, but there you go. Apologies to anyone from AOL. So even if you are not using cloud within the business, I can guarantee you that if you have a service provider, they're using cloud to deliver some of the services. Because of the fact that we sell the following benefits to the customer, actually we recognize those benefits internally as well, and we use them. So most of the services that we sell now and give to you, for example, penetration testing, vulnerability analysis, vulnerability scanning, pretty much everything, we're moving all of that into our internal private cloud and delivering those services from our private cloud to you, right? So your vendors, your outsourcers are all going to be using private cloud to deliver services. Therefore, even if you don't use it yourself, you need to understand it and you need to understand the risks of it. Okay? So why do we do it? Virtualization, consolidation, do more with less, flexibility, grow, shift, automation, price virtualization. It's a nice way of saying you can shrink and you can grow and it costs you less or it costs you more. High density and green computing. Surprisingly, that is a big differentiator in certain countries, particularly the Netherlands and Germany. It's almost the first question out of people's mouths after security. Higher levels of security and availability. And I know people going, that sounds a bit odd. Actually, because when you look at a cloud environment, and particularly the kind of, the greenfield cloud environments, they're all set up, they're all incredibly uniform, right? It's all the same technology, they're all virtualized, they're all done in exactly the same way. They're all highly automated, and it doesn't matter who you buy it from, IBM, Google, Amazon, they're all very uniform. Of course, everyone has a slightly different flavor of how they do it, but because the environment is so uniform, it gets rid of all the crud, it gets rid of all the internal kind of legacy equipment, legacy systems, legacy processes and applications that actually make security incredibly difficult to do internally in organizations. All of this stuff is new kit, and if you don't like it, we can just, in about 2 hours, we can build you a new machine from scratch and wipe it away. Okay? In terms of doing that, I'd just like to speak very, very quickly about SLAs. There's an excellent presentation earlier on about SLAs. One of the things that you need to understand as a customer coming to a vendor, and it's any vendor, is that we're never going to volunteer information that is prejudicial to our case, right? But if you ask us a straight question, we'll give you a straight answer. If you were to ask me, for example, do we offer SLAs in cloud computing for security, my answer would be yes, but I'm not going to tell you that unless you ask. Because if you don't ask the question, I'm going to write the contract with no security SLAs. If you ask me the question, I'll tell you, yes, actually we have SLAs, and this is what they look like, all right? So keep in your mind that you have to ask the right questions of your vendor, okay? Another good point about SLAs is please do not attempt to write them yourselves. All the vendors in the world have huge numbers of people who spend hours and hours and hours writing SLAs, and we're experts at it. We are really, really good at it, and so are the other vendors. Customers, by and large, and I hate to say it, are very poor at it, right? And one of the things that is most important to consider, that if you measure something, that's going to drive our behavior. If you come up with an SLA, that's where we're going to put our effort to meet that SLA. Not necessarily to provide a good service, but we're going to meet the SLA. And that's where things like bonus malus regimes come in. Bonus malus, for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, is if we do well, you pay us more. If we do badly, you hit us over the head and take loads of money off us. All right? We do not typically offer bonus malus regimes inside of cloud computing. It's not impossible for us to do it, but we don't do it normally. What we do in many cases is offer liability. Right? So if we lose your data, we will commit to a certain amount of money that we will give you if we lose the data. Right? It's those things that you have to ask us to do. We will never volunteer that information. Okay? In the small print, funnily enough, it says read your contract, then read it again. Right? Cloud computing, as was alluded to earlier on by the legal guys, is very much, it's an outsourcing agreement, and it lives and dies by its contract. We can talk about sexy technology, we can talk about how wonderful everything is, but if the contract is bad, it's going to be a bad service. For both of us. That's why it's actually in our joint interest to ensure that the contract makes sense and is actually understandable to a layman. There's no point having a contract that is legalistic to the extent that you do not understand what it actually means. Right? So we go to great pains to actually write contracts in English. There are funny things that you will see in the public cloud contract environment that you will see less of in private cloud and hybrid cloud, but if the contract says this is not for production data, or this is not for production use, as a large number of the public cloud providers' contracts state, that should be a huge red flag to you. That is saying that if everything goes to hell, actually, if it's your production data, we're terribly sorry, it's not our fault, we told you it wasn't meant for production data. In the very, very small print, because, we hate you actually asking these type of questions, is the URL for the Cloud Security Alliance questionnaire. It's an absolutely fantastic document. If you know nothing about cloud and you sit down with a vendor and you go through that questionnaire, not only will it educate you about cloud, but you'll be asking 99% of the correct questions. Right? There are some questions, by the way, and I talked to Paul earlier on about that are not on that list, and I may or may not put them on the list because I really don't want to answer them. But that is a very, very important URL. It is. And also, we love when you come with that particular questionnaire because we have prepared answers. We don't have to spend, for one customer, I actually spent 2 years negotiating the security aspects. They were a bank. 2 years negotiating the security aspects of the deal. All the time I was begging them, would you please use this? Would you please use this? They decided they wanted to do it their own way, which is absolutely fine. One of the things you have to come with is a security policy, unless you want us to impose our own. And that's also okay because we use ISO 27001. But it helps if you know what the limits of your policy are and you know what your risk appetite is. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So inevitability. Cloud computing is coming. I think we're all you've heard all that today. So essentially, this rather complicated graph says it's happening. It's happening more and more. And this graph actually excludes software as a service because that's already reached the tipping point. It's already being heavily utilized. It's only going to get more utilized. But this is about public cloud. Now, if you come to many of the traditional vendors, the IBMs, the HPs of this world, we actually tend not to immediately sell you public cloud. We will sell you probably private cloud with multi-tenancy, or if your requirements are very different, probably private cloud. The reason is there are some inherent problems with public cloud that none of the vendors have actually solved yet, and I'll go into those in a short while. It's not that we're not looking at it, and you'd be surprised, by the way, at the amount of cooperation behind the scenes that goes on with providers. The previous speaker is from EMC, but was ex-HP. I've worked with IBM in the past. I've worked with Google. We all talk, and the reason we all talk is very simple. Security, when it comes to the cloud space, is a joint problem for all of the providers. If any one of us has a security breach, that affects all of us because it affects the public perception of cloud. We want you using cloud because it's good for us from a delivery perspective. It's good for you from a CapEx and OpEx perspective. We want you to use it, and therefore all of the vendors cooperate jointly to ensure that we have the best possible degree of security at a reasonable price, shall we say. This is mobility. As you can see here, this is the data explosion. Sort of going up in laptops and desktops, but look at the curve when you see it on mobile devices. It's practically stratospheric, right? You'll see different statistics here, 24 times between now and 2013, 39 times between 2014. Everyone agrees on it's going up really, really quickly. Nobody necessarily agrees on exactly how fast it's going up, but it doesn't matter. You can see the trend. Now, a little bit about why you're going to be using mobile computing. And some of this is a little bit futuristic, shall we say, a bit of crystal ball gazing. But the main thing here is IT is no longer in charge of who does what, when, and where in the company. Nobody really cares about whether we tell you you'll use this laptop and that desktop and this phone. Because the business is paying for everything these days, they're buying pretty much what they want. And our job is to ensure that, our job is not to say no anymore. I was really happy 15 years ago as a security person when I said no and people went, oh God, oh, we can't do it then. That was wonderful. That doesn't happen anymore, unfortunately. If you don't work with the business, they'll just simply ignore you, right? So therefore, you've got to think of strategies on how to control what they're going to do because they're going to do it anyway. In terms of, because computing is becoming commoditized, and cloud computing is the ultimate commodity and will become the ultimate commodity for the simple reason is, and this is the crystal ball gazing bit, it hasn't happened yet, ultimately cloud computing between the different providers will be interoperable, which means today if you have your workload on EC2, you'll be able to move it to HP's cloud or IBM's cloud or any other provider's cloud. That's pretty much inevitable. It hasn't happened yet, but there's lots of work going on to make it happen. It's very good news for you, not perhaps such good news for the providers, but it's very good news for you because it means that if you're dissatisfied with the service, there'll be a common data framework. What there potentially is going to be the most problematic bit is the common contract framework, but that's also being worked on as well. How do we then differentiate ourselves? How does EMC differentiate? How does IBM differentiate? It'll all be about the service, right? So the cost of the service, the technology will be effectively irrelevant, right? It will all be about the cost of the service, the quality of the service, the SLAs that you get or don't get, okay? Very soon, and I was reading on the Metro, I was reading on the tube coming in with the Metro magazine, their statistic doesn't agree with that one. They said actually by 2014 that there's going to be one mobile device per person. This is slightly different. It's based on actual research. In terms of threats, what is different about the cloud and the mobile environment from the traditional IT environment? This is, the usual frequency, how often it's likely to happen versus what the impact to your business is. And you'll be familiar with most of these: pandemic, regulatory compliance failure, natural disaster, and so on and so forth. Green is internal and white is external. Some things are both internal and external. So that's what the standard threat map looks like. It's actually also what the cloud and mobility threat map looks like, because it's actually all the same threats. Nothing actually changes when you move to the cloud. These are risks you're already running. These are things that can already happen to you, right? So, when we talk about, the threat of cloud security, the threat of mobile security, you're already doing it. It's just how you control it and how you understand your risk stance that's different, okay? Attribute view of cloud, and I'm sorry I nicked this off Microsoft. I hope the Microsoft guys have left now. So public and private cloud, internal, the hybrid is a mix, right? So you have infrastructure as a service. You may have seen this earlier on. I hope you didn't, but anyway. Platform as a service, software as a service. From an attribute perspective, what you see is the level of abstraction as you go up the stack to software as a service. You're not seeing the tin anymore. You're just seeing the application, right? That has some weird effects. For example, you're practically in control of nothing in software as a service. You can't see the device. You have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. All you really have to protect you is your SLAs, right? Comes a funny one when your auditors tip up and say, actually, what version of that software are you running? Well, we're not running it. IBM is or HP is. You are still responsible for your own compliance, is what I'm saying here. It was mentioned earlier on, but don't forget it because it's very important. The flexibility of purpose. As you go down the stack, you increase the flexibility of purpose. So infrastructure as a service, you can do pretty much whatever you like on it, okay? What you can't do from most providers is have root access or admin access. We will permit you to do that, even in a multi-tenant environment, because we dedicate the machines to you, and so do most other providers. But what we will do is we will take away your SLA. If you want to have root access to a device, be our guest. There is no SLA on it, okay? So you have to be, and it'll come into force a little bit later again, you have to really think hard about your application makeup, and particularly authorization and access management. And again, I can't stress enough, IAM, if you don't get it right, you are wasting your time doing cloud. It'll actually do you a disservice. Control and governance. As you move from public to private, obviously you have greater control. In private cloud, you still don't have a lot of control. We still own the stack. You might own the application. You might run the application. Most of the time you don't. You just see the product of the application. We own everything else, right? And you have to take our word for it, as was mentioned earlier on, that we're honest and good, because you have no way of measuring directly, right? One of the things that you should do, by the way, when you're talking to cloud service providers, the biggest thing that always trips people up is right to audit, right? It was mentioned earlier on. Most vendors will not give you a right to audit, or will argue about it a lot. The reason is we don't want you poking through our laundry, if you will, right? Particularly important if you're in a regulated industry where you have the so-called snap audit that we all live in fear of, which is the regulator turns up and says, I want to see X, Y, and Z, right? We had huge discussions about whether we would permit that to happen or not. Actually, in reality, it was a complete waste of time. You cannot prevent the regulator from turning up, and you cannot turn them away from the door. So even if your provider says that they won't do it, actually they will, because otherwise they'll come back with the cops, right? And that's not good for anyone. Economies of scale. As you grow into the public cloud, obviously you're doing more with, it's more open. Private cloud, there are certain things that we can't do in the public cloud, which is why sometimes we don't sell them, right? Things like PCI DSS, things like 21 CFR Part 11, HIPAA, GXP, certain workloads from government and military. For example, there's a HP private cloud for Her Majesty's government that's only used for the government here in the UK. We tend to push you towards private cloud if you've got unusual or highly strict compliance requirements. Multi-tenant private cloud, which is kind of somewhere there, again has its own challenges. The first question that should spring into your mind if you're in a shared service environment is, your question is, where is the data flowing? Where does it touch other people's data? Does it touch other people's data? Is it encrypted at every point? Data in use, data in motion, data at rest. 9 times out of 10, the answer will be no. It's encrypted, hopefully, on the tape drive, the LTO, using native encryption. But typically, you don't see encryption. I don't think there's, off the top of my head, I can't think of any provider currently who will offer you encryption data at rest as part of the overall package without you having to ask for it. It's generally extra for everything. But then again, moving towards the public cloud, I just don't think that for a lot of workloads, for a lot of particularly standard outsource environments, public cloud is not necessarily 100% suitable yet. So shared service environment is typically where we go, which has some of the advantages. It's not as cheap as public cloud. It's reasonably cheap, and it's reasonably secure, right? We will never, by the way, what people sometimes misunderstand is cloud is a service. It's outsourcing. It's not a security service. It provides a service to you, an application to you, an infrastructure element to you, SAP, Oracle, whatever it is. We provide basic security. So we provide antivirus, we provide policy management, and a bit of a security officer to look after your audits. You can have, you can have anything in addition to that within reason, but we're going to charge you for it, okay? The only thing you can't do, and the only thing we can't add in some cases, are things like DLP, which actually materially affect how we deliver the service, because we use a standard global delivery. So your service can come from Singapore, India, Germany, wherever, and you have to accept that. That's non-negotiable. Otherwise, you're into a dedicated private cloud, right? So there are certain things, and we're very clear on what they are. There are certain buttons that we will not allow you to press, right? We're very flexible up until a point, but there is a point where we will say, actually, this is not suitable for you. You should go private cloud, or you should go talk to somebody else, because all the vendors are annoyed about a data breach, about a security breach. And we are particularly paranoid now that cloud is taking off, and it's not just us, it's all the other vendors as well. We will do anything to avoid a security incident, even turning a customer away, okay? Major issues, data dispersal and international privacy laws, they've been covered in great depth. I'm going to skip over them broadly speaking, except for that bit, classification. As a customer, if you have no idea what data you have or what it's doing or what its classification level is, we can't talk to you until you figure that out. Because at the end of the day, it's still your data. We're a data processor, you're the data owner. The regulator will come after us, but they will definitely come after you, right? So you have to understand what your data classification is. You'd be amazed at the number of people who have absolutely no concept of what data they have in their environment and what it does, whether it has PII or whether it doesn't. There are approaches that we and other vendors can assist you with in determining that, but essentially that's an organizational and cultural issue. It's not a technology issue at all, right? You have to understand that yourselves, okay? Need for isolation management and multi-tenancy. Question you ask is, what is the data path? Show me it all along from the network, from the blade itself, through the network, to the storage. Where does it go? Exactly where does it go? And don't forget to ask, by the way, also about the vendor's data. Because the dirty little secret, and the thing that people always forget, is that we keep information about you. There's security information, there's ticket information, there's performance measurement, there's all sorts of stuff, some of which is extremely sensitive, right? So don't forget to ask the vendor, where does your data go as well? Because typically you'll find, in many cases, that it goes somewhere elsewhere than the petite little environment in Europe that you thought you'd bought. So watch where the data goes, not just for yourself, but also for the vendor. Logging challenges. Who did what, when, and why? It's becoming, well, it's actually legal. We touched earlier on about the Data Protection Act. Italy has an unusual interpretation of the Data Protection Act, and so does Spain. It differs from most other people's interpretations. When we provide a service in Italy and Spain, we have to provide a list of the administrators who are managing that system and have that list available to turn over to the authorities within 24 hours. So we have to have an up-to-date list of who's doing what and where they're doing it. And that's legally applies. In order to do that, we have to have an SIEM as part of that service. It's now absolutely standard. When you buy a service from us, logging comes with it. We don't necessarily tell you about that, but it does, okay? Authentication, authorization, and IAM. I know Paul stressed it a huge amount earlier on. I'm going to do it again, right? If you get this wrong, you are wasting your time. Fix it internally. Before you go and buy cloud from a vendor, fix your information and access management environment internally before you even consider going to cloud. Because if you do it without fixing that, you will just end up in a complete mess and we won't be able to help you, right? Data ownership issues, covered that. Quality of service guarantees. Again, comes back to SLAs and SLOs. Also, was mentioned earlier on, but be careful about your vendor being an outsourcer as well and using third parties to deliver stuff, because the chain of trust should technically stop with your outsourcer, but actually doesn't. Security of virtual OSs in the cloud. There is no good fix for this problem. When you virtualize something, you essentially double the attack surface. There are some new approaches. I mean, for example, there's a bunch of vendor, there's antivirus products, and there's, Tipping Point has a virtualization watcher. There's really no good solution to this problem yet, so just be aware of it. Possibility for massive outages. If you buy a cloud service, you're going to get an SLA, hopefully, on availability. You should look at things like, is it dual data center? Do they have multiple redundant links and all that good stuff as well? The problem comes when, if there's an outage, you're down and you're gone. That's it, right? You have no comeback if you don't have a bonus malus regime. Encryption. Encrypt everything. Actually, no, that's a lie. Encrypt data at rest where practical, right? And in some cases, the technology will not support it, so you won't be able to have it even if you want it. These days, database encryption is becoming a practical possibility. Previously, it really wasn't. It was in the products, but it just was not usable. Obviously, over the network, encrypt, use secure protocols. Data in use encryption, and it's part of DLP really as well, is something that we're getting requests for at the moment. It's something that technically, with our cloud infrastructure and with other vendors' cloud infrastructures, that we cannot fulfill. So we're trying to do it, but we can't actually do it yet. Public cloud versus internal cloud security, we've talked about that. You know what that means, right? So mobile security challenges. So you get all the stuff in cloud security. I mean, as I said, most mobile applications, most mobile deliverables these days are delivered from the cloud, and I've got 5 minutes left. So in that sense, you've got all the cloud security challenges, and they're challenges. In other words, we can overcome them, we have overcome them. We've overcome them like EMC for the kind of clients who are so heavily regulated they have 20, 30 audits per year. And if we can do it for them, we can do it for anybody. So in terms of mobile security challenges, things are mobile. People lose phones. Again, big shout out to Steve Jobs. What a fantastic guy, and I'm very, very sorry he's dead. Apple suffered from this. Now, the reason you'll never see a security person criticizing another firm's losses is the old thing about when the Aztecs were sacrificing the poor sacrificial victim. They said, today you, tomorrow me, right? We will never criticize another company for a security breach because we know that our one is just around the corner, okay? No physical security boundary. You're living with it today, doesn't change. Data in use and data in motion encryption. Realistically speaking, you must have two things if you have mobile devices. The capability to remotely wipe them and the capability to encrypt them, right? There are lots of other legal challenges around whether somebody, and I just talked earlier on outside to a fellow about this, if you download your mail and it has potentially a contract in it or customer information, and you skip over to the States, is that a breach of the Data Protection Act? Technically, yes, because the data is on the device. So the way some companies are approaching that is they're actually virtualizing the mobile device. So actually, the data doesn't travel, you're actually remotely viewing it. Does that protect you? No, it doesn't, because you're still breaching it because access is still transfer. Another misnomer that people get in their heads is encrypting the data will protect you in terms of the Data Protection Act. It doesn't in any way. Whether the data is encrypted or not is irrelevant. It's still data, and it still can be accessed. Okay? Data dispersal, that's the issue there. Why is nobody panicking about this? Because everybody's already doing it. The only problem is the law hasn't caught up. It will catch up, and it'll be pragmatic, because the law ultimately is there to deal with the scenario as is. So people are thinking, we're going to get killed if we do such and such thing. No, you won't. The law is practical. The law is pragmatic. It will catch up, and then you'll have to pay a lawyer for sure, but that's life. In terms of the guidance for cloud mobility adoption, there's not a lot of it about, right? But there's extremely good information on mobility adoption and extremely good information on cloud adoption. Your own UK CESG, the BSI, ENISA has some somewhat outdated these days cloud security documentation and mobility adoption stuff. For preference, I'd use the CSA stuff. It's bang up to date, and it's It's used by your providers, so we're used to the kind of questions that they ask. These are all the things you could possibly do, right, for mobility assurance. Understand your data and understand what's going onto your mobile device. That goes without saying. Device password, obviously. Encryption, very much so. Whitelist, don't really care. Connection methods, yes, that's important, but it's a fundamental part of it. Block jailbroken devices, if practical, sometimes it's not practical. Remote wipe. So out of this whole list, and antivirus, I'm not entirely convinced about antivirus on mobile devices. Mobile devices are now reaching the stage where they won't actually just freeze if you put antivirus on them. But I'm actually not sure of the value proposition for mobile antivirus. If you're securing the channel to the device and lock it down sufficiently so that the user can't load random stuff onto it, you should be, broadly speaking, protected. I'm not sure of the total cost of ownership or the actual business case for antivirus. But of the whole list, definitely remote wipe and encryption, most important things. So like all the other vendors, what we're actually talking about when we're talking about cloud adoption is risk management. Because at the end of the day, it's your risk, right? If you come to us and say, I want to do X, Y, and Z, we will be happy to take your money, right? But ultimately, you're running a risk. You have to understand what risk you're running. So you've got to know what you have. You've got to know where your data should be in 3 dimensions, where it is, what it's doing, and where it's going. And if you know that, you're ahead of 99% of the companies in the world. We'll always ask you to know it, but it's very difficult, and we appreciate that. But again, we, like EMC, like IBM, like most of the other vendors, will take you through a risk assessment process that will help you determine whether you're ripe for cloud adoption or not. And this is not something we charge you for. I don't think any of the vendors charge you for this. It takes up your time, it takes up some of our time, but we're happy to do it because at the end of the day, if we get our risk management right with you, you'll be a happy customer. That's all I've got to say on the subject.